Hello and welcome to today's video. In today's video I'm going to show you a few different ways of joining in a new yarn. So this can be used whatever you're knitting really. I'm kind of specifically looking at how to join a new yarn when you're knitting lace and how it will show. Mini skeins are very popular at the moment. A lot of indie dyes do mini skein sets, mini skein clubs, things like that. So when you're knitting with mini skeins, you tend to join in new yarns more frequently, and with lace knitting especially, weaving in yarns can cause a bit of a problem because they can be a bit visible. I must admit, most of the time I tend to just join in the yarn at the beginning of a row and then weave it in, and I have even on very long rows joined it in the middle somewhere and then just woven it in to a more kind of solid part of the lace pattern, if that makes sense. But in this video we're going to look at a few different methods for joining in a new yarn. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please give it a thumbs up. Please leave me a comment and tell me if you've used any of these methods, or let me know if there's any other methods that you like to use. Please don't include any links in your comments because apparently YouTube will hide them if you do that, so don't include any links please. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing, and thank you very much for watching. The first join we're going to look at is the one that I use the most often, and it is called a split splice join. So I'm going to do this with a yarn of the same colour just so you can see how kind of invisible it is. This join is only really suitable if you are using a yarn that can be felted. I mainly use it for yarns that have a single ply construction, like this yarn here. This is a 4-ply, it's a thin 4-ply monostil Uruguay Fino, which is a blend of merino and silk, but it has a single ply construction. I find this works really well for single ply constructions. So I've only done this with the yarn that is a 4-ply or thinner. So let's see how it works with this one. So I'm going to use the same color for this one. Now with the split splice join, you do literally have to spit into your hand. I've never actually tried it with water, but I've been told it doesn't work with water. I'm going to spit into my hand. In fact, I'm going to lick my hand. I have just washed my hands so they are clean, and I'm going to do this off camera. So you don't need to see me licking and spitting into my hand. So I basically just made my palms of my hands wet on both hands. Then I'm going to lay the two yarns overlapping a little bit, I don't know, a couple of centimeters, and then I'm going to start rubbing. So rubbing them as fast together as I can without knocking my camera over. Just going to check, so it's starting to felt there. I'm just going to add a little bit more saliva. Hang on, it's very difficult to do this without knocking my camera over. I do sit, when I film tutorials, I sit with my arms around a tripod, and it can be a little bit difficult to do this kind of motion without knocking the camera over. So quite often I find I have to rub for a while. And just going to check that it looks like it's been all felted. Okay, so normally I'll probably rub it a little bit more, but I'm going to leave it like that. The problem with this method is that obviously you're laying two strands together, so you will end up with a thicker bit. But if you rub it really hard and keep working on it for a bit, it will usually become a little bit thinner. And I do quite often find the yarns that have this kind of single ply construction do sometimes have a slightly thicker bit, slightly sort of less spun bit, if you like, slightly unspun bit. So I have rubbed these together, and if I pull it, pulling that quite hard, it's not coming apart. I'm pulling that quite hard and it's not coming apart. So let's carry on knitting so we can see what it looks like. I am knitting in a lace pattern here because I primarily design lace patterns. I don't always design lace patterns, but I think the question I was given was about joining in yarns for lace patterns, so that's why I'm doing this in the lace pattern. So I haven't actually knitted over the yarn that I joined yet, so we're going to do that now. I'm starting to knit over the yarn I've joined. If you made the yarn very wet, you could leave it for a couple of minutes to dry. this is not very wet, so I'm going to just carry on knitting with it. It's only slightly damp to the touch. By the way, I knit continental style with Norwegian pearls. So I'm purling now, and that's Norwegian pearl. If you're interested in my continental knitting course, online course, you can find that online. So I've knitted across the yarn that I felted now. I'm just going to do another row quickly. Okay, so I knitted a couple of rows past where I joined in the yarn. Where I joined it in is here. I can see it. The yarn is slightly darker. That's probably because it's slightly damp, and it is a little bit thicker. So if I look at it like that, I can definitely see where it is. But this yarn does occasionally have slightly thicker bits anyway. So I think if I knitted a whole shawl, I would not really be able to pinpoint where I joined in the new yarn if I came to look at that shawl later on. What you can spot when you look at it like that and you know where the problem is, compared to what you can spot when you're wearing it, or what somebody else can spot when you're wearing it, or what you can see when you kind of look at it later when you finish a shawl, there's a big difference between that. So if you see little imperfections that you think you can spot, probably not going to be that big a deal when you finish the item, unless you really go looking for it. So that's where I joined in. I can see it, but I don't think it's too bad. I'm happy with that join. I use that join quite a lot. It will only work with yarn that are non-superwash though. So now let's look at another join. So now let's look at another join, which I use quite a lot. Well, this isn't really a join as much as knitting in your ends. So that's another option that you can do. So I'm going to do this with a different color, just to make it easier to see. So I've finished knitting with this yarn, and I'm going to start knitting with a different color. So normally, when I normally join in a new yarn, whether it's the same color or a different color, I would normally just leave a strand of the old colorway hanging down, pull out a strand of the new colorway, leave those hanging down, start knitting with the new color, and then at the end I would just weave in the ends. I don't normally tie my ends together or do anything special. I just start knitting and then that's it. This join is called the Clasped weft join. For some reason I struggle to say that, I don't know why. So this is the old yarn that I've been knitting with, and I'm going to pick up and knit with this new color now. So what I want to do is, if I lay this out, it might be easier to see what I'm doing. So I'm going to lay the new color out like that. So I've kind of made a little bit of a bend in it. I'm going to take my old color and take it under that yarn and through, so that it's basically looking like that. So the colors are kind of interlinked, so they kind of, can I show this like that? They kind of go through each other like that. And then I'm going to carry on knitting. So to start with, I am going to be knitting with my old color. Now this will, I'm going to pull this one a little bit shorter just so I get through it quicker. Now this will mean that you will be knitting with a double thickness for a bit. So it depends on what you're making. Sometimes that can be okay, sometimes it's not okay. It might be too obvious, but it depends on what you're making. So now do make sure that you are knitting with the right bit. So my old tail is here, and then I'm knitting in this direction. I made this a bit shorter to make sure I get to it a bit quicker. So I'm going to knit the first two. I'm going to carry on in my lace pattern. Okay, so there you go. I'm now joining in the new color. The problem with this method when it comes to joining at the beginning of a row, if you're changing colors for example, is that you will be doing the first few stitches in the old color. So if that's the case, you might want to stop a few stitches before the end of the previous row and then do this, so that you finish the row in one color and then start the next row in one color. But that might be difficult to work out, so you'll have to work out whether that's a good idea or not, but that's certainly something that you could do. Okay, I'm just going to knit this to the end of the row. Okay, I've done quite a few stitches now with that new color, so I'm going to separate the tail and let it hang down. So that is what that looks like. Basically, I've done this whole row with double thickness. So that is the only problem with this method, is that you do end up with a double thickness. But then we did do that with the spit splice joint as well. We did end up with a double thickness, but because we rubbed the yarns together and we'd felt them a bit, it wasn't like a full double thickness. It was a little bit thinner because the yarns were kind of squished together a bit. So I would say it's a little bit thinner than doing it this way. Now when you finish knitting, you can just cut these strands and trim them down. If you're doing something lacy, I would leave them till you've blocked it and then trim them. So I'm just going to do a couple more rows and then we'll have a look and see what that looks like. Okay, so I've now done this, finished this. I've now knitted in, knitted a couple of rows after the row where I knitted in the end. And I don't know how easy this will show up on camera, but if I look closely, I can see that that row is a little bit thicker. But again, I don't know whether it's going to show up that clearly in the finished product. You can see at the end here that I have started the navy blue row later. There is a little bit of a kind of jog there, if you like. So what you could do with this join is to stop a few stitches from the end on the row before you want to change color, and then double the yarns across each other and then finish the row with the old color. But you need to try and pull the tail or the yarn, length of yarn, short enough so that you only knit the stitches that you need to knit to finish the row, if that makes sense. And that can be difficult. So what I would do, say I stop, I don't know, 6 stitches before the end of a row, I would guess how much yarn I would need to finish 6 stitches. I would knit the 6, I would twist my yarns around each other, knit the 6 stitches, and then I would, if that works out perfectly, fine, I'll carry on. If I still have a bit of the old color left, I would probably work out roughly how much I had left, go back, readjust my tails a bit, and then try again. And you can try that 2 or 3 times. And if it's, because it's only a few stitches, it wouldn't really take that much effort to work that out. But that is a join that is quite good, especially for scrappy projects. It's fairly easy to do, and it does leave your ends feeling quite secure. So on that same topic, let's look at another way of knitting in your ends. So I'm going to break that yarn. I'm going to be good and use my scissors. I always just break the yarn using my hands, but it sometimes means I nearly knock my camera over. You use the doing stranded color work, you can do it like stranded color work, where you knit with one color, then you knit with the other color, and then you knit with one color, then you knit with the other color. But that doesn't work very well with lace knitting if you're changing color. It works okay if you're knitting stocking stitch and you're continuing with the same color. I would basically hold one color in my left hand, one in my right hand, and I'd knit with the right hand, then I'd knit with the left color, then the right color, then the left color, and you basically alternate between the 2 strands, the 2 yarns every other stitch. And for just changing color in stocking stitch, that works quite well, because you only end up with 1 yarn for each stitch, and then you kind of strand them at the back like you would for stranded color work. Doesn't work so well with lace knitting. But let's have a look at a technique. I think this is the technique that Stephen West uses. Weaving Stephen, I think it is, he calls it. I don't think he invented that technique. I've certainly used it long before I heard of Stephen West, so I don't think he invented it, but I know a lot of people know it as the weaving Stevens. Hang on, let me focus on what I'm doing. So I'm going to start knitting with my new color, which is the navy blue yarn. No, it's not. My new color is light blue yarn. Okay, so let's start knitting with the light blue color. So I'm going to knit the first stitch, and then I'm going to take, it's a little bit difficult to start with because your new yarn is a bit loose, but I'm going to take my new working yarn and my old tail. Where is the old tail? So that's the navy blue tail, and I'm basically going to if I hold, so it doesn't matter if you do this continental style or English style. In fact, I'm going to knit one more stitch before I do this, because it just makes it easier to secure my new yarn a bit. So leave my new tail hanging down, and then I'm going to focus on my old tail first. So I'm going to take that yarn, the old tail, over my new yarn, and then I'm going to knit the next stitch, and then I'm going to take it over again, and then I'm going to knit the next stitch. Now the next stitch, I'm going to do it over again, and then I'm going to do a yarn over, and then I'm going to do an SK, and then I'm going to take the yarn over again. So just take the, you can take it under, over, doesn't really matter. I basically just twist it around my new color. Knit one, and then I'm going to take it over again. Some people will alternate, so they might take it over and then under and then over and then under. It doesn't really matter. Right, I'm not going to do any more stitches than that. Then I'm going to carry on with my lace pattern till I get to the end of the row, and then we'll have a look and see what that looks like. Okay, so on the next row, what I sometimes do when I get to, oh no, that's the wrong tail. That's the problem when we're doing this different techniques. I get to the wrong tail, and I think it's the tail I'm looking for. So let me just, that's where the tail is that I just did my little trick on. So when I get to that tail, sometimes if I'm worried that it's not going to be secure enough, I will do it again. So I will sometimes stop one stitch before I get to the tail, so the tail's coming out of that stitch, and the next stitch I'm going to knit is the one in front. So I will cross it over. This is a bit of a pain to do on the purl side, when you purl with the yarn at the back like I do, and then I'm going to take it to the front, because you have to take it to the front and cross the yarn over, and then, so sometimes I will go back a few stitches. So if I take that yarn to the front, take the blue yarn over, and then I have to take it to the back again to purl. This is possibly easier to do if you purl English style. The one, and then on the next row, because I still have this tail here from when I joined in this lighter blue color, so on the next row I would do this yarn the same way. So problem with this is when it comes to lace stitches, sometimes you can get a little bit of a loop behind your lace stitches. So I'm just going to knit one more row to see if this shows up a bit better. I'm not going to knit in that new tail. I'm just going to knit. So if you get to there, can you see here that that's strand there? Let me just use my scissors to show you. That strand there is the tail. That's the old yarn that I was weaving in. That's as a result of trying to twist it around. But obviously when you have the yarn over, it's not going to get twisted around, so you end up with this kind of loose strand there. So that is one of the problems. It doesn't necessarily work that well with lace knitting, but it is certainly worth exploring if you are needing to weave in a lot of ends or change yarns frequently. It's worth trying. If you have a section where there is less patterning, it might be worth trying it on that row. If you have a wrong side row where there is no lace patterning, you can do it on the wrong side row. But if you have two ends, so your old end and your new end, you would have to do it on consecutive rows. So one of them would have to be on the right side row. If you're going to do them both on the wrong side row, you'd have to be a little bit careful about where you join in, because if you join in here, you won't be able to do it on the right side row. So you'd have to join in at the start of a wrong side row. And then you would have to weave in one yarn on one row, one wrong side row, and then on the next wrong side row, do the second yarn, which means that it will have to be carried up the side a bit. So you just need to make sure that you work out how you're going to do that. So it's not a foolproof method. I think it works quite well with stocking stitch and possibly other stitch patterns, but I don't think it works very well with stitch patterns that are reversible or lace patterns. I have used this method before. It is not my favorite method to use when it comes to lace patterns because it can look a little bit messy, in my opinion. Another method which I do use sometimes, and I actually used just recently on a brioche project, which worked quite well, is to actually just hold 2 strands together. So I would just, hang on, let me just finish this stitch. So when I start a new row, I would just hold the new yarn and the old yarn together. Obviously these are different colors. But I would just hold 1 strand of the new color and 1 strand of the old color. So I'd put the old new tail hanging out, and then I would just start knitting, and I would knit in the old tail, and then I'd work back, and then the next row I would knit in the new tail. Again, it doesn't always work that well with lace knitting because you end up with 2 strands. You end up with like a double strand color, but that is certainly also an option, which is similar to the options we've already looked at, really. Okay, so let's look at one called the magic knot. This one is one that I only recently came across, and it's quite interesting. So I'm going to, this is my piece of knitting, so this is the yarn I'm knitting with. I've left the tail slightly longer. Again, I think this is one that's difficult to do at the beginning of a row, so when you change, if you're changing color, it's a little bit more tricky. So I'm going to take the yarn over, take the tail over the working yarn, so that the tail crosses over the working yarn. Then I'm going to take my new yarn, and I'm basically going to do the same thing, but this time I'm going to make sure the tail crosses under the working yarn. So if I put the tail down like that, and then I just cross the working yarn over. So here the tail crosses over the working yarn, here the tail crosses under the working yarn. So the loops should be about similar size, and then I'm going to put, oh hang on, the first loop on top of the second loop. So the one that crosses over on top of the one that crosses under. Then I'm going to take the tail from the lighter blue yarn, and I'm going to lift up the loop slightly, and I'm going to go under and up through the middle. So I'm going to take that tail and go under, up through the middle, so that it loops around the darker blue yarn. And I'm going to do same thing with this one. I'm going to go up, down through the middle, and out through the bottom. And then I'm going to take the 2 tails and pull it tight. Just pull both ends tight. And then now make sure when you cut it that you cut the right yarn. So you may need to scroll back and watch this a couple of times to practice. So try and cut as close as you can. This can be a little bit tricky with fine yarn, but if I pull that really, really tight, it's not going to come apart. So let's just try and knit with that. Again, it's difficult to get this to line up with like the beginning of your row. So if you're changing color at the beginning of the row, this is a little bit tricky to get this to line up with the beginning of your row. If you're just changing color from one color to another yarn of the same color, then I think it works really well. But I think it's a little bit tricky. Hang on, what am I doing? Am I doing? Yes. Just checking that I'm doing this correctly. Hang on. There we go. Okay, just make sure I'm knitting the right stitch pattern. Oh, hang on. 1, 2, 3. Knit 2 together. So I'm still knitting with the old yarn. Now I'm coming up to the knot. And I'm going to knit, so that's where my knot is, and knit across the knot, knit 2 together, yarn over, and knit the last 2. And then I'm going to turn, and I'm just going to do the next row quickly so we can see what this looks like. I've done a couple of rows past it, Let's just see if I can see where it is. Okay, so I can see it on the back. Don't know whether you'll be able to see it. It's just there. I can just about feel it. I can't really see it from the front. I do think I can see where I started knitting with it. So I knitted all the way across here in the light blue, and there it changes to the dark blue. So again, I think it's difficult to make this line up with the beginning of the row if you are knitting if you're changing color, but I think it's probably quite a good one that you could use if you are knitting with the same color. Okay, so let's look at our final knot. Now this one's also called the magic knot, but it's different from the last magic knot. I've seen this used quite a lot in jewelry making when I bought necklaces or bracelets that have like a leather cord or some kind of cord, and then this is quite often used as a knot to secure it together. So this is the yarn that I'm knitting with, so that's attached to my knitting, and that's on my left. And my new yarn, which is attached to the ball of yarn, is on the right. So I'm going to put that like that, that one like that, or put it like that. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to take the dark blue yarn, which is my old yarn, and I'm going to go over the lighter blue yarn, the new yarn, and then under the old yarn. So it goes, the blue yarn comes here, it goes around, it goes under the new yarn and under the old yarn like that. And then I'm going to take the end and go through here from the top down. If you do it from the bottom up, it won't work. Okay, so, and then tighten it. So we've now tightened it quite a lot. So we've now just tied a knot around this blue yarn. And at the moment, you can still pull this blue yarn through. I'm going to pull that through a little bit more of that blue yarn actually, so I have enough to actually do this. So now we're going to basically do the same thing with the light blue yarn, with the new yarn. So I'm going to go over, hang on, pull out a little bit more of it so it make it easier for you to see. So I'm going to go over and under. So I'm going over the blue, dark blue, the old yarn, and then under the new yarn and the old yarn. So I've come, the new yarn comes from the ball over here around, and it goes under the old yarn and under the new yarn. And then I'm going to again take it through the hole and tighten it. So tighten it really, really tight. So now I've just tied a knot around the other color basically. So if I now pull the, don't pull the tails, pull the working yarn, you can see how that one adjusts like that. And then pull it really tight and then cut it. And then I'm going to cut this one. There we go. And then, so that feels fairly secure. So now just try and let's just knit a bit with it. Now it is quite a long way, so I'm actually going to, just to make it a bit quicker, I'm going to loop a bit of yarn through there. Normally you would just start knitting with you wouldn't have this loop through here, but it's just to make it a little bit quicker, because I made that tail of the working yarn a little bit too long. Okay, so that's where the knot is. I'm coming to the knot now. I'm going to purl. I'm on the wrong side, so I'm doing my Norwegian purl. If you want to learn how to purl the way I do, and knit the way I do for that matter, if you want to knit and purl continental way and the Norwegian purl, I teach you all that in my continental knitting workshop, which is available as an online course, as well as in person. So I'm going to just do one more row in the lace pattern. So my join is here. On this join I can actually just about see it. I think it just depends on where it happens to fall, because on the previous one it kind of ended up on the back and I can just about see it there. But on this one I can actually see it from the front. I think it just depends on exactly where it ends up. So I can see it and I can feel it, but it is really, really tiny, and you definitely would not see that in the final object, in the final thing you were knitting. So let's just look at, I did mention this one earlier, but let's just actually do it, because this is probably the one I use the most. So let's look at one final one. This is basically just knitting with two ends together. So I'm going to do it in one end of each colour, which doesn't always look that great in lace knitting. I did do it in a brioche cowl recently and that worked fine. So I got my old tail, holding it together with a new yarn. So my ball is over here. So I'm holding my old tail and my new working yarn together. And then the tail of my new yarn is hanging down. And I'm going to weave that in later. And then I start knitting. So if you knit English style, it's the same thing. You would just hold it here. So make sure you only knit with the old tail and the new working yarn. Leave the new tail to deal with later. So whether you knit English style or continental style, doesn't really matter. And you're just knitting with the two strands held together. And you don't need to go too far, just a few stitches, that's probably more than enough. And then I'm separating out the old strand and I'm dropping it. And then I'm carrying on in the new strand. And then I'm just going to knit another couple of rows quickly, just so we can see what it looks like a couple of rows later. Now sometimes what I will do on the next row, when I get to that first tail, I will actually pick it up again and knit a few or purl a few rows on this row with it as well. So that's where it is. So that was the last stitch I knitted with it. So sometimes I will purl that stitch and then I will just pull it a little bit, not too tight, but just to make it a bit snug again. I will pick it up with my working yarn and then I will just purl a couple of stitches, 2, 3, 4 stitches with it, and then I will separate it out again and leave it hang down at the back and carry on knitting, or purling rather. And then now we're on to the next row. You do the same with the tail of your new yarn. So you can see here I got the tail on my new yarn. I'd now pick that up with my working yarn and work a few stitches with that. The disadvantage with this is that you do end up with it all kind of in one place, and it does make it a little bit thicker. Obviously here I knitted with two different colors, so you can kind of see it, but it can blend in, depends on the thickness of yarn you're using and the colors you're using. This is probably the one I use the most when I'm joining in a new yarn and I don't want to weave in the tails later. So when I'm doing lace knitting, if I'm joining in a new color or a new yarn and I don't want to weave in the tail later, this is probably the method I use the most for lace knitting, because it does follow your other yarn. So it does kind of knit in with your other yarn, so you don't get this problem we have with the method also known as Weave and Stevens down here, where you end up seeing the colour you're weaving in kind of poking through the yarn over. Okay, so those are a few different ways so you can join in a new yarn. As I said, it depends on what you're knitting, whether you're joining in a new ball of the same colour or whether you're joining in a different colour. Depends on which method you might want to choose. Also, as we saw, some of these methods work quite well with lace knitting, some of them don't. My favorite method, if I'm working with a lace pattern and I'm working with a yarn that is not superwash, also wouldn't work, I don't think, on pure silk, pure cotton, pure bamboo, or yarns which have a high amount of cotton, acrylic, bamboo, silk. Basically works best on wool yarns, non-superwash wool, or yarn with a high non-superwash wool content. It's the spit splice join. I do like that one, and I do use that one quite regularly. But it does have to be a yarn that will kind of fell together. The other method I use regularly is the clasped weft join. I do quite like that one. but again, it will, because you have to knit a few stitches with the old color and then a few stitches with the new color. It is a little bit tricky if you're changing color at the beginning of a row. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think. Let me know if there are any other joins that you know about that you like using. And if you have any questions, please leave a comment below. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please give the video a thumbs up and please consider subscribing if you haven't already subscribed. Thank you very much for watching.